Hello and welcome once again. My name is John Van Etten. I'm the Managing Director of Human Synergistics office here in Germany. And I'm happy to take the time today to talk to you about organizational culture once again. And today's topic is really along the lines of how to introduce the topic of organizational culture to leaders and organizations and the key pillars that I think are important to support that message. I have done a previous webinar on various methods to introduce human synergistics models, including our circumplex model behind me, as well as our how culture works model. So if you're interested in that kind of content, how to use, for example, the iceberg model and others to introduce that larger perspective, happy to provide link to that content. I think that'll be helpful for you. Today's topic is a little bit different, primarily how to, again, introduce the topic of culture and help leaders to understand its relevance and its importance in the organization. So, um, so the question I've started with today, and I think it's a useful and relevant one for leaders and people in organizations, is really what drives the business forward. So when we think about our organizations, especially as we fulfill leadership roles, helpful to think about where we're going as an organization, what we're all about, what we're trying to achieve and accomplish, and to take a few minutes to think about what really drives our business forward. It's an interesting thought experiment for leaders, and we actually take time to do this. But usually, what we find is that regardless of what industry we are in, and really what the overall purpose of the business is, our ability to achieve those goals and to do that effectively is really a result of our people. So it's not the external environment. It's not necessarily the structures and systems within the organization. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the success of the business and the performance of our people is dependent on our people, the individual's efforts and actions. So again, what drives decisions and behaviors within our organization? When we look at our people in terms of the actions that they take and the decisions that they make, how they work with one another, what is behind that? What's driving and influencing that pattern of behavior? And this is what we're talking about when we're really talking about organizational culture. So sometimes I like to think of organizational culture as truly being the invisible driver within the organization that's driving the ultimate performance. When we really look at organizational systems, we're very good at recognizing and measuring many aspects of that system. Ironically, however, the culture of the organization itself, the extent to which people are actively focused on goals, solving problems, collaborating with others, is something that's very rarely, in fact, measured. So if we're going to talk about culture and its importance, then it's nice to have a brief definition of what we're really talking about. So culture is a term that's used in a variety of different contexts. So I think it's helpful not only to get clear on what is culture, but more specifically, what is organizational culture and what we're talking about within organizations and businesses. So again, those patterns of behavior that influence and guide people in terms of how they approach their work and how they work together with others. If we can get a concept of what organizational culture really is, then it begins to become clearer, I think, to understand how that's so important and powerful. Again, if we sort of are zooming out and looking at the patterns that influence and predict how people make decisions and approach their work, that begins to inform how broadly and powerfully organizational culture drives business performance and well-being. So this then begins to introduce the three, what I like to think of as pillars that we should be standing on if we're thinking about organizational culture and performance in our business. So the first is that culture is the primary driving force behind these three key factors in organizations. The first is the well-being of our people. So when we think about things like employee motivation, satisfaction, intention to stay in organizations, their engagement level, those are strongly predicted and primarily predicted by the culture within the organization. The second point, the second pillar is that organizational culture drives performance as well. Again, thinking about the fact that this really predicts and influences how people take action, whether they take action, it starts to become clear and how powerfully this begins to affect other KPI criteria like customer orientation, frequency of errors, overall productivity, so on and so forth. So when we truly track organizational performance and how we deliver at the end of the day, the best predictor of that fact is the culture of the business. The third and final point is that culture really reflects the extent to which we are living our values. The way we work today compared to our values is a reflection of the extent to which we are consistent with those values, role modeling and representing them. And of course, for many organizations, in a very positive way, understanding what our values are and the extent to which we're currently living those values is tremendously helpful. And again, if we find things that are happening that are different than our values, then in our current culture, that is a very helpful opportunity to develop. So I'll just take a moment to break each of these points down a little more deeply. A couple of numbers coming from other research and publications. Fact is that 50% of employee burnout is predicted by culture. We see dramatically lower stress and burnout rates and lower employee and turnover rates in what we call more constructive cultures. These are the kind of cultures that motivate, engage employees, make them feel valued, excited, and motivated to be a part of that organization. 70% of employee engagement is driven by culture. We have so many clients who are measuring engagement as a key performance indicator of their people. And it is incredibly helpful for them to understand where that's coming from, how culture is influencing engagement, so that we can promote the kind of culture in the organization that drives positive engagement in our people. And the third point here is really just to illustrate that there is a flip side as well. While organizational culture can help and contribute and enable our people to perform at their best, it is also possible for those patterns to get in the way, to hold people back, and make forward progress more challenging. So understanding not only what the current patterns in the organization are, but how they're actually affecting our people, both in terms of well-being and performance, is incredibly helpful as a foundation for, again, understanding why culture matters, why this is important, and moving forward from a developmental perspective, in what direction we want to develop and how we're going to do that. So this is data that we also see within our measurements as well. So human synergistics, of course, researches and develops instruments to measure psychological and behavioral patterns in people, teams, and organizations. And our OCI, Organizational Culture Inventory, is the most widely used instrument to assess organizational culture in the world and has been for over 40 years. What we're seeing here is the same kind of information that we saw on the previous slide. Organizations with more strongly what we call constructive cultures score much more positively in terms of things like employee motivation, satisfaction, goal and role clarity, and much lower on negative well-being outcomes such as stress. So illustrating the fact that culture drives employee well-being and the psychological well-being of our people is a very powerful and important connection to make. Again, the second pillar, switching from culture drives well-being to culture drives performance. So companies are known with more constructive organizational cultures, more goal-oriented, creative, and adaptive sorts of behavior, are known to be more profitable as organizations, more adaptive moving forward, and more sustainable. Profitability, this statistic is increasing 25%, productivity by 17%. This is something we see in our data as well. Organizations with cultures that are increasingly constructive enable and facilitate people to bring their best, contribute their high performance to the organization, and that cascades through the entire business. And the final point around culture drives and predicts whether initiatives and strategies will be executed successfully. So when we think about in our organizations, the initiatives that we've implemented, the strategies that we have moving forward, whether we'll be able to implement those strategies effectively is primarily predicted by the patterns of behavior that play out within that organization, i.e., culture. So this is getting back to the famous quote that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and it very much is true. And we see that in organizations that understand organizational culture, that measure this and strategically focus on building and developing culture, see the kind of performance playing out that we would like and expect. Here we're seeing lower levels of mistakes, errors, and safety issues, higher levels of employee motivation, satisfaction, and engagement, higher levels of profitability, and so on as a function of culture, not only measurement, but culture development. Again, understanding how broad the effect these patterns are in the organization upon our people and performance is extremely enlightening and important so that we can prioritize culture development and create real and sustainable change. The third pillar that I've mentioned earlier was the fact that current culture really represents the extent to which we are living our values. And based on the OCI models, we're able not only to measure current operating culture, but our clients are able to describe their ideal cultures as well for themselves, those behaviors that are most consistent with and represent living our values. So culture is really reflects whether the values are truly lived or simply stated. Secondarily, purpose-driven organizations tend to focus increasingly on values and the fact that we should be living those values, not just espousing them. And this third pillar is tremendously powerful because we should be, if we are going to measure and develop our organization's culture, we should be doing that in the direction that not only is better for our people well-being, enables them to perform most effectively, performance, but is also the kind of behavior that we espouse and value within this organization. The final point here, that only 19% of employees today will say that their current culture is aligned with or consistent with the values of the organization, unfortunately, is a statistic that we see as well. Again, here's a large research data set where we're looking at organizations on the top, asking them what kind of behavior within their culture is valued, ideal, and appropriate, i.e., what should be taking place or what are our values. Below this, you can see the profile for the current operating culture across those organizations. In other words, what is currently playing out within the organization. That comparison of what is currently taking place versus what should be taking place, what represents living those values, is again a very helpful foundation for development and change, and something that is, I think, incredibly insightful to be able to measure, not only measuring our values, measuring current culture, and being able to understand exactly to what extent we are walking the talk and living those values. So that really represents the three pillars that I try to lean on and really encourage our clients to support their development moving forward based on those three primary pillars of associated with culture. Again, it is the organization's culture that is primarily influencing the well-being and psychological health, well-being, engagement, and motivation of our people. Again, those behavioral patterns in terms of how people work together and approach their work are the primary factor behind how we actually service customers, whether we learn from mistakes, how frequently safety errors, safety issues and errors take place, and so on. And finally, the organization's culture truly does represent the extent to which we're living those values of the organization. And thankfully, what we find is something truly synergistic, and that is that within our models, we find that the kind of behavior that contributes most positively to your people's well-being and satisfaction and motivation are the same patterns of behavior that contribute most positively to their performance, their ability to work cohesively and collaboratively with others, their ability to get their work done effectively and achieve goals. And they are also the same kinds of behaviors and patterns that we're talking about in our values and mission statements. So that synergy across the three pillars is, I think, tremendously helpful, not only to justify why we are doing this in three fundamental and important reasons, but how focusing on one factor, organizational culture, enables us to guide our business and our people forward across all of these factors. All right. And therefore, organizational culture is truly the unseen driver of an organization's performance. And thankfully, however, it doesn't have to remain that way. I very much like this image because it sort of illustrates what human synergistics is about, measuring that factor that is often unseen and unrecognized, bringing clarity to this so that we have a framework and a language around which we can describe and discuss organizational culture, what is going on, what are our values, what's consistent with that, what's helping to drive and lead our people and business forward. Therefore, what is good leadership and what should we role model and enable in our people and teams? And again, having that with a common framework, a common language to speak, as well as the ability to measure these factors with scientific reliability and validity, enables us to provide our clients with the truth around how the unseen driver is currently driving the business forward, and moving forward, the kinds of things we should encourage from that driver to more consistently and predictably drive our organization into the future. All right. That's actually the content that I had for introducing organizational culture. This time, I'm really trying to keep things simple. Introduce the concept of culture, give people an understanding of what it is, so that they can therefore understand how it's relevant and influential in their business, and focus on the three primary, again, pillars, justification for which we use these kinds of methods. All too often, in my experience, by the way, I see organizations who will focus on one pillar alone. So when they're thinking about what they might want to, why they're addressing culture and why they may want to develop that culture, all too often we're focused only on one pillar. We're doing this, for example, because we want better employee engagement and trust. That's pillar one around well-being. I also have clients who approach us because they recognize that what's going on is not living the values, and that's key to our organization, and we want to understand that difference and to close that kind of gap. That's pillar three. So there are all sorts of very positive reasons for understanding what our culture is and potentially moving forward to develop that. But I think it's helpful in every case to recognize and to leverage more than just one pillar when we're developing and initiating a culture development initiative. This isn't just about creating a healthier workplace and driving greater performance. It's about living ultimately the values that we espouse and walking the talk. So I hope this has been helpful. If there are any questions, please feel free to enter those into the comments. As always, this recording will be uploaded to our website. So if this is helpful to you or you feel helpful to anyone else, please feel free to share that link with them. Thank you to everyone who took part today. It's lovely to have the chance to talk once again about organizational culture. Please feel free to reach out to Human Synergistics anytime you have any questions or anything we can help you with. Thank you.